I have a couple of
Is
Rings do that, do
they
they?
do? They jump
Okay.
possibly.
I will take mine out. Yeah, this one's gonna have hard to take.
If you're grasping it right against it.
Okay,
if-
I'll use this side.
Might be my flight jacket. Well, thank you all for coming out on a rainy night. I'm Bill Holstein, on the board of the Overseas Press Club, and former China hand. I was there in January 1979. I was sent out from UPI to be the young man on the ground to try to figure out what is it the Chinese are trying to do here. Are they capable of emerging from the Cultural Revolution and ideological struggle to create a new economy? Can they do it? And lo and behold, of course, the answer 35 or 36 years later is, hell yes, they were capable of doing it. And so over these years, we've come to believe that the Chinese were sort of a predictable quantity, that they would keep growing at 9% rate of return. They became the world's second largest economy. You know, incredible how that happened. They developed a worldwide footprint in terms of their acquisition of resources, exports of goods, exports of workers. They blossomed over this period of time into a world economic superpower who wanted a strong currency. They wanted to become accepted as a member of the international reserve currencies. They wanted to stand tall and be accepted as co-equal of the United States economically. And so as we've been managing this often difficult process, we began to assume that there was a certain continuity, a certain smoothness in how the Chinese would manage themselves. Growth would be steady, and we knew that they were trying to undergo a transformation of their economy. They're trying to move out of being a cheap manufacturing platform because they want to move away from the things that pollute, as Liz has written so much about. They want to move into more technology, value-added areas. They want to become more consumer-focused. They want to have more services, more service sector. They want to make more money off their international investments. So in the mindset of many China watchers and many people in the world, it became baked into our perception that China was a pretty stable, pretty mature contributor to this global economy. Then things started happening. Stock market correction, dramatic correction, sudden devaluation of the currency, capital flow, outflows, slowing growth. The growth may only be 5 or 6% or less. Nobody knows. Nobody believes figures anymore. And so suddenly, all the assumptions we've had over these years is being put to the test. So the question to the panelists, who I'm not going to introduce because you all know them, they're all well-known players in this space, is what does this mean? And so Liz Economy from the Council on Foreign Relations, I'm going to pick on you first. Is this a period where we're going to look back and say this is when the Chinese miracles came undone? Economist magazine here, look at this. I don't see your name on that, Gady, but this is what was on the cover of. So will we look back at this and see this was a decisive moment, or is this just blips on the radar screen? And to say, on last thing, this all occurs as Chinese President Xi Jinping comes to this country this month. So it's quite a fine stew we have here.
Right. So thanks, Bill. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be with such an illustrious group with Lynn and Gady both. It's really terrific. So is this a blip or is this the great fall of China? All these good titles from The Economist. You know, I would say it's really too early to tell. I think we have to be wary of, in some respects, doing what the Chinese did back in 2008 in the middle of our own global financial crisis, when they sort of said, okay, that's it for the United States, right? We always knew we were going to rise. We always knew we were going to take over as the #1 economy, as the great power. It's just going to happen a lot sooner than we thought, and the U.S. is not going to rebound from this period of financial crisis. And obviously that's not the case, right? And the Chinese have learned that over the past 7 years or so. So I want to say, I think we don't want to make that same mistake and say this represents, the end of the Chinese miracle. I think there's more resilience within the Chinese economy. It's a complex beast. There are still pockets, I think, of strength and potential strength that hopefully we'll discuss as the hour progresses. What I think is important in terms of thinking about blip versus precipitous fall is, when we look on the ground in China, are we seeing real progress on the sort of economic reform agenda that President Xi laid out a couple of years ago in fall 2013? What are the benchmarks that we're looking for? Because if we're seeing real progress, and these are kind of sort of the growing pains, right, the transformation pains, then I think, okay, these are blips. If we're not seeing progress, then maybe it's something more substantial. And I think the US-China Business Council has just come out with another one of its sort of reports. I'd say they think progress has been quite limited along the sort of full spectrum of the reform package. So, I'd say I'm at this point kind of cautiously pessimistic about the state of affairs. But I'm reserving judgment because, I bet you could look 6 months ago and that title was just the opposite.
Right.
So I don't want to chase the headline.
All right. So Gady, I asked you on the phone where you came in on this, and you said that this is a blip, but the blips are going to get more serious as time passes. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's right. What I meant is that economic growth is slowing in China. There's no question of that. And
Gady has just come back. Let me say, I promise not to introduce, but he's just back after 12 years of living in Beijing and back in 1 month. So he's fresh from the fields of Beijing. So go ahead.
Indeed, which only makes me probably less knowledgeable to have been that closer up to it. But the economic growth is slowing in China, and it's just a fact that when economy slows, it's much more challenging, especially for an authoritarian regime. That is historically the case. The thing with the cover, The Great Fall of China, I want to address, which is not mine. It's mostly the work of the great Simon Rabinovich, who expressed and writes out of Shanghai for us. But it specifically applies, as you'll see from the red.
Yeah, I read these stories,
The red wall.
and they don't support the theme on the cover. But this is an old trick. Editors do put something on the cover that doesn't.
It's an irresistible cover, the red wall. But it's of course that red line represents the stock market going down. And I do want to address if we're going to talk about this blip. I would actually say the real blip is the larger macroeconomic environment and political environment that Elizabeth just talked about. I'm not as concerned about a couple of the things that people have been writing about recently, although they're completely legitimate to write about, which is the stock market. If you were to have asked me ahead of this summer, what is the part of the financial system in China that's most likely to have an embarrassing meltdown? Stock market, easily number one. I mean, it's never been a really legitimate market in the same way the Western stock market is. It's always been seen, even by people who play it themselves domestically, as a bit of a casino, as a policy-driven market.
It was created by the government.
Right, it was created by the government, and almost everybody listed at the beginning, and for a long time were state-owned companies, and it wasn't, the judgment about whether you got listed was entirely political. People have been playing, have been insider trading, doing insider trading on the stock market from the very beginning. I profiled a guy in early 2008 when the market was at its previous peak, just before a collapse then, who told me, exactly how you operated stocks as an insider from the late 90s, early 2000s, when he did it, until he lost a lot of money because there was a corruption scandal that froze stock trading. It had nothing to do with the underlying fundamentals of any of the companies. And nor did any of the ups and downs really throughout the 2000s, and from up until about 2003, while the stock, while the economy was growing, people were losing their shirts, and that was probably when I wrote my first story about pensioner disappointment in the Chinese stock market. And then there was some major policy decisions, especially one about what kind of state-owned shares won't be dumped on the market, that helped spur a bull market that went to 2008. There have been policy decisions ever since that have helped guide the market up or down. And you have to remember that it grew tremendously up until the point of this crash this summer. So I just do not see it as connected to what's going on in the larger economy. Another story that's been in the news a lot lately, legitimately so, and I've written one of these myself before I left China, is about the dying Rust Belt of China.
The zombie factories.
Zombie factories, zombies that are sort of zombies no more. Some are still running at a loss, which is what they do. They're kind of the centers of of job creation. These towns depend on them, but some are shutting down, and this is leading to great economic dislocation, especially in the Northeast and in the North, in Hebei. I visited a town that had closed dozens of rock quarries, and some of these places are experiencing negative growth. This is part of what happens with an economic rebalance. I mean, the fact that this is happening is partly because a big part of it is they've been overinvested. There was great overcapacity for a very long time, but it's also because they are taking some of the pain that they should be taking in a rebalancing.
To make the transition to their vision of the new economy.
Right. So I'm not prepared to say, although it's a huge challenge for them, as were massive state sector layoffs in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's a huge challenge for them at a difficult time, but I'm not prepared to say they're not up to it. The service sector of the economy is growing strongly at this point. I think they are attempting serious reforms, even the ones that are stated. Some of them don't go far enough, particularly with SOEs and large SOEs. But I do think that attempt is being made. What was the third thing I was going to get into? Oh, the Tianjin explosion. Well, completely shocking to everybody. Not shocking. The causes of it aren't shocking, which is poorly managed industrial facilities where permits were granted or not even bothered to be gotten by well politically connected people. Unfortunately, it happens all over China. It happens in other countries too. And we've seen other chemical plant explosions that don't get big headlines. That's once again, it represents a serious concern about government legitimacy, but it's also one that at the central level, of course, I think they would like to be able to improve on and to attack, a problem they'd like to attack. Whether they're capable of it long term is a real question. They've already allowed the economy to be degraded, as the environment, as Elizabeth Economy has written about in her great book, River and Play. So it's a long-term legitimacy question that I do think they're grappling with, but whether they'll be successful or completely fail, I'm not prepared to say that at this point. I'm more inclined to think, I'm a kind of a recovering collapsist. I'm more inclined to think that they'll go on, they'll continue to muddle through, as a common prediction, that they'll go on much longer than the collapsists would like to think.
I remember when I was in Beijing, we had a saying that people would come through from New York and spend 2 weeks in China, go off and write books. They had such certainty about what they were going to say. But then other people would come and spend 2 months, and they couldn't write anything, maybe one magazine article. But if you'd been there for 2 years, you couldn't write anything, because you had no knowledge, and you're just completely confused about it.
Yeah, I do wish I'd written a book after 1 week.
So Gwen Guilford spent 6 years in China, now with the courts, is a real specialist on the structure of the Chinese state-owned enterprises and companies. Well, so what's your take? Is this a defining moment, or are we in the West making too much of it?
So I think we're making too much of it in terms of the stock market collapse and the revaluation of the yuan. That these are signifiers, pardon me, of the China collapse, the Great Fall of China. No. So I don't think blip versus permanent reality. I think if you think the permanent reality is that there's going to be a financial crisis or a collapse or whatever, no. But the blips are a consequence of the way, like a larger systemic change in the economy that is making it so that basically the Chinese government has a lot less control than it used to have over growth. And there are a couple of reasons for that internally. So the economy has long been driven by investment, right? And there's just not that much productive investment left. And therefore not as much growth. And they're also running out of the money to power that investment, power that growth, because capital flows are reversing. So, that's partially because the economy's slowing down and these things are self-reinforcing, but also the larger global context with the expectation that the Fed's going to raise rates. So, that's not going to change, and things will probably calm down after that happens. But I think we should expect more of these scary blips Like,
So
that's the
do you think
reality.
the Chinese leadership, let me ask your panel, has the Chinese leadership looked at these series of incidents as a problem or as merely tinkering that they need to readjust, and do they regard this as having made mistakes? Liz, what do you think?
So I think that the danger is that they regard it as sort of one-off blips, and in some cases don't understand some of the systemic challenges. So Wim was talking about the systemic challenge on the economic side. I think there's also a systemic challenge on the political side, right? So both the Tianjin disaster that Gady raised and this sort of stock market crash, I think reflect some lack of transparency and official accountability and the rule of law writ large within the system, right? So Gady said, we're not surprised by the Tianjin explosion. Well, why is that? We're not surprised because, you know what, environmental impact assessment process in China is completely corrupted. And so when people go out and they say, oh, well, look, 100% of the 120 people that we interviewed, nearby this, sort of storage facility, said it's fine with them to have it placed really close. Well, right, you know why? Because A, they only report the people that say yes, and B, they offer them little mini gifts if they say yes, and the whole thing is just corrupted. So the question in my mind is whether, and then you look at the response to the stock market crash, and what did the Chinese do, right? They controlled information.
They arrested 200
right?
people.
Exactly, arrested people. They froze assets. They did everything that you're not supposed to do.
If it's a real market.
Exactly, that you
Right.
don't do in a real market economy, which again is underpinned by those things that I just mentioned, right? Rule of law, official accountability, transparency. So, in my mind, there's a much larger systemic challenge that they need to address. And I think that those sort of issues, they're only prepared to take baby steps, because that speaks to far more fundamental political reform, which this Chinese administration is clearly not prepared to undertake. So I think there are many more blips to come, but in part because they're not willing to do this kind of systemic reform that they need to do.
Either of you have any of that, or I'll rush on with other questions. Go ahead.
Well, I would like to piggyback on that. I do think Elizabeth is exactly right. They're not taking aggressive enough steps to prevent future blips. They are taking steps, however you want to call them, baby steps, whatever. I think Xi Jinping is very interested in local officials having less ability to corruptly hand out permission to have a chemical plant right next to wherever it is, a river or population. That's what he's doing with his rule of law reforms, which aren't about rule of law, but they're about arrogating more power.
Rule of law, as long as it helps the party.
Yeah,
Right.
supports the party and also the central party, arrogating power upwards. And he's trying to reduce local official meddling when citizens want to bring legitimate complaints. It's a baby step. It's not rule of law, but it is something where they recognize that they have a problem. Similarly, they are in cadre evaluations. They've elevated the importance of the environment in evaluating how cadres do their jobs and whether to get promotions, etc. These are very important and critically important. Now, it'll take years for this stuff to kind of work its way through the system. People have to see that they're actually rewarded for good behavior on the environment before they will start behaving well in the environment. And I think that's, in other areas, I think that's a real challenge. It could be, you could have some more lost years while they do these steps very gradually. But that's the way the system works. It's about gradual reform. They're afraid to do things too boldly.
So let me ask Wynn then. We're here about markets. I was reading in today's Wall Street Journal, another very internationally recognized. The Americans are going to say to Xi Jinping when he's here, when are you going to embrace the market? And when are you going to embrace market-based reforms? So it seems to me that maybe they're talking past each other in the dark, that what Americans think of as market-based reforms, the Chinese, I'm not quite sure. Did you see that, Gady? So what do you think? I mean, where are the Chinese on embracing anything we in the West understand as markets?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of examples of China having a different definition of a word that we commonly use, and the US or everyone else kind of having a different definition. Markets might be one of them, not totally clear yet, but rule of law, or another term, and democracy. And those I'm not being cynical here. Those terms have different meanings in China. Markets here, well, okay. In the third plenum, people in which Xi Jinping laid out this incredibly long list of really impressive, visionary, sweeping, bold reforms, and in them said that the market would be given a more decisive role in setting prices.
Decisive role, that's a key phrase.
Yeah, but there's more to it, and that, at least my reading of it, was that great, it will have a more decisive role provided that SOEs are allowed to become more efficient, whatever that means. And we're actually at an interesting point right now. In the next few weeks, the government should be coming out with its SOE reform announcements, and we'll see, is making SOEs more efficient, does that mean consolidating, just making bigger SOEs? Does it mean, getting private investment, but retaining control of the SOEs so that, you're basically getting the private sector to bail out the state? Those things are not, that is not advancing reform. It's not making the economy more efficient, because it will continue to, the economy will continue to rely on investment as a result of, blowing up SOEs even bigger. But more importantly, you're not going to be privatizing assets in a way that they would be, have a chance of being used more productively.
I think you said something very important, that there are different definitions for these terms, that market means something to us, it means something different to them. Rule of law means one thing to us, it means something else to them. Democracy, these big words that we're throwing around, but we're not necessarily talking about the same true underlying concepts. We have different versions of this.
Just add under the party to all of those things.
Right.
That's a pretty simple way of understanding those terms.
Right.
That's true. I mean, everything still has to be subordinated to.
So the markets, we accept markets as long as they support the party. Democracy as long as it supports the party. Rule of law as long as it supports the party.
Right. As long as they are underneath party leadership.
Right. This is what the guys in Washington think. Yeah.
Well, I think we saw that philosophy on display with the response to the stock market. That they think they can use. I mean, it was actually, that was a little surprising to me. Not surprising that they didn't technically manage the stock market very well, because I think they've had difficulty bringing in credible people. Actually, there was a very good story by, I think it was Reuters, during all this, about kind of how the stock market in China had recruited a bunch of kind of really credible Western experts on equities and how to manage insider trading, et cetera. And many of them left because they were so frustrated with kind of the bureaucracy. And it's been tough to change that culture. But I was a little surprised by how political the response was. And partly, I think it was because they were so concerned about having played out the stock market, which was pretty stupid. In the state media in the months before, just lots of articles that were talking about how great this bull run was.
They encourage individual Chinese investors to use the equity in their homes to invest in the market.
Yeah, and I think that they recognize that was a mistake at this point. I think they also overestimated, though, how crippling it would be to have a stock market crash. I think they wanted to show a good face to those investors that they had encouraged into the market, but I think they overestimated the importance of doing that. So that was a big mistake, but it shows their philosophy about these kinds of market operations happen underneath the leadership of the party.
If I could add really quickly to that, I think I haven't heard a good explanation yet of what the heck they were thinking. And that's true with the stock market. It's also true to a lesser extent, but with the revaluation. I mean, you can tease out, well, it's probably this, but and it's probably not this. But so I think really we don't know. So I think that there are probably maybe 3 or 4 reasons, 3 or 4 possibilities. Let's see, they have poor information, which they did on the stock market. The margin trading was out of control, and they clearly had no or at least seems to me, did not realize how much of that was tied up in there. When they kept blowing up the market around about April, May, like it was time to like cool things down at that point. Didn't do it. So, and also with capital outflows, didn't seem to realize how like revaluing the yuan a little bit on August 11th was going to cause, you know, such a hullabaloo.
Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed out of China. Hundreds of billions?
Right, and that was pretty predictable. But, you know, they didn't predict it. So are there theories wrong? Could be. Is there some sort of problem with the decision-making mechanism, like, and this is, you know, the scary thing that people talk about, that there's dissent at the top, and, you know, this explains the erratic behavior, and, you know, when you have dissent at the top, things like Tiananmen happen. And basically, like, none of those is a very satisfying answer to any, or, you know, they can kind of work, but you know, just, oh, there's one more, that they see something that we can't see. So I think this is possibly what is happening, or happened with the stock market, that there was some sort of financial exposure that they're like, we've got to get it, we can't let it drop. And
you know, a risk of contagion that we didn't see.
Right, and, you know, we're never gonna see it, but like, you know, they're not idiots, like that was a really dumb move. And so, you know.
Well, let me just, for whatever it's worth, what I have heard is simply that there was actually a very significant debate at the topmost level over whether or not to go in and, you know, rescue the market, right, or give it support from the state, and that it was Xi Jinping who made the ultimate decision to do so. Now, the underlying reason why he decided to do that, I mean, to my mind, if you look over the history of Chinese economic decision-making, right, in terms of just thinking about the overall shift of the Chinese economy as they try to move, you know, as they try to rebalance and move away from investment-led, export-led growth to consumer-based society, you know, every time the Chinese economy seems to be slowing a little bit more than they're comfortable with, what do? They launch another run of investment. And so, to my mind, it's a very typical and not surprising response on the part of the Chinese leadership to launch a rescue plan, right? To save face, to protect, right, its reputation, and to some extent, maybe to protect the Chinese people, right? But, you know, you're dealing with a government whose, you know, source of legitimacy, right, is twofold, right? Economic growth and nationalism. And if you let the stock market fall and people really lose, you know, their house over this, then you've lost a pretty significant source, one pillar of that legitimacy.
Right. I think there's a third pillar that goes against this, which is a reputation for competence.
Competence.
Yes. In other words, that they sort of know what they are doing.
That's a reputation being imputed to them, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah. That's right. I'm not saying it's necessarily a deserved reputation completely, but they have built institutions of their own, you know, in their own way in China. They're not Western-style institutions, but I think that they believe that their legitimacy in part rests on, you know, actually doing a good job of these things, of managing these parts of the economy, et cetera. And so it's not just about economic growth and nationalism, but it's also about looking like they know what they're doing. And on that last point, they certainly fail in this respect. But I do agree that, you know, if they were just thinking about that first pillar, then it would be quite sensible to go ahead and merge it. But I'm sure many people were debating on the other side of it.
Agreed.
Let me ask one last question, and we'll see if we have any questions from the floor. So we've never really truly understood what happened in China, how they make decisions. It wasn't a problem in 1980 or 85 or 90, but now they're the world's second largest economy, world's largest population, second largest military expenditures. I mean, they're engaged in trading patterns with every nation in the world. Everywhere I've been in the world lately, the Chinese are there. So the challenges of managing this relationship, it seems to me, are growing. Could we be in for a period of time when we get continually surprised by things happening in China, things that ricochet out, things that have impacts globally that And what can we do about that?
Absolutely, we'll continue to see. I think we'll continue to see big challenges out of China from what happens domestically, and also business on.
Are you live?
Could you touch the bottom until it's green?
Okay,
This
Great,
is his
thank
lead,
you.
though. Well, we got to get this part.
And of course, we should be concerned about how those events ricochet not only over to the global markets, but also to how Chinese political kind of winds blow in terms of the region, how they interact with Japan in the South China Sea. The more that they might have troubles at home, you could see a risk of the nationalism pillar being relied upon more to worrying effect. And I think that's a concern. And if they already, of course, present a challenge to the region and to the United States with the way they approach the South China Sea and the East China Sea in Japan. So I think that's going to continue to be an issue. And of course, the U.S. hasn't come up with a way to deal with. They haven't come up with a strategy that they can agree on to deal with China's cyber hacking, however you call it, cyber attacks. They're, as we've seen in headlines in recent weeks, they're kind of debating whether to impose sanctions, how effective would they be, and of course this is happening not without coincidence, just ahead of Xi's visit that they're making this discussion public. I think it makes you think probably they're not going to be imposing any sanctions, but they want to look tough. This is an ongoing challenge. It's been true of the U.S.-China relationship for a very long time. There's not a lot of leverage that the U.S. has. They have to really pick their spots, and I think it's increasingly challenging.
Quinn, are we going to see more shockwaves, more surprises?
Yeah, I think I don't really have much to add to what Gady said. And I actually I don't really understand, this is not my area of specialty, so the U.S.-China relationship, there's a lot I don't understand, and the lack of leverage that the U.S. has explains a lot of it, but we're at this pivotal time right now. Is that going to change? It'll be interesting. I don't really,
All right. And
I guess for me, I look back over 20 years of working on China, U.S.-China relations, and think I'm constantly surprised.
you've just been over there and talking about it a little bit.
I was just there this past weekend. I would say China's constantly in transition, right? It's always reforming. This is, a period of heightened reform and very specific kinds of reform in the political and economic fronts. But if you look back at China, any 5-year period you choose, it's virtually almost unrecognizable from the previous 5 years. I think that's how much the country changes and how rapidly it changes. And who would have predicted? Well, I wouldn't have predicted Xi Jinping 3 years ago, that this is what China would look like today. And this would be what China is doing on the foreign policy front, at home, etc. So I'm constantly surprised. And, big part of that is, as you're suggesting, I think the opacity in the decision-making, system, decision-making structure. As far as the U.S.-China relationship is concerned and leverage, our leverage is greatest right at this very moment. And I think that's why we're, as you're suggesting, Gady, this is why we're putting forward these ideas about, okay, maybe we should talk about sanctions. Also because we're sick and tired of cyber attacks. There is a reality to all of this. But look, it's very important to the Chinese government that this is a good meeting. And that was the whole purpose of the dialogue in which I participated over the past weekend, was to talk about, in essence, it was an invitation to the Chinese how to make this a successful meeting. They really want this to, produce something positive, right? And for Xi Jinping to be displayed in a very positive way.
I heard that they want this visit to be as successful as the first visit of Deng Xiaoping to America.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, I wonder where you heard that. So in any case, I would say that that's probably not going to happen, given the current state of affairs. I would say I'll make only one comment, because this dialogue was sort of off the record, and I would just say I was surprised at the sort of perception, the gap in perception between the United States, the participants and the Chinese participants. I think that the Chinese did not display a very strong understanding of the current political climate in the United States. But this was not an economics dialogue. This was really a security, much more of a security dialogue, political and security issues. And in fact, economics barely came up. And when it was discussed, the Chinese side ignored it. And there was no sense, as far as I'm concerned, no sense within the Chinese side of things that the sort of economic blip or great fall was in some way going to affect their overall strategic position or, the One Belt, One Road or anything else moving forward. So it was an interesting set of discussions, but in many respects, I think we talked a little bit past each other.
Very interesting. I promise to open up for questions. Please raise your hand, identify yourself. Yes, sir. Right here. Okay, we have to borrow a microphone, sir. All right.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Matthew Robertson. I write for the Epoch Times. A few thoughts. One is,
Question. Please ask a question.
can I make a comment disguised as
We ask questions here, please.
Okay. Well, my best was a comment disguised as a question, but let me just ask.
Usually people don't admit that. Just go ahead.
If you do it well enough, we'll let you get away with it. Be clever about it.
Be epic. I thought it was I thought kind of that it's a bit unfair to criticize the Chinese government for the stock intervention. Why would they be expected to just suddenly let it run like a market when it was not built as a market? The whole thing's not being run as a market. And according to Larry Long Xianping, who did like this really super detailed analysis on TV, he's a serious guy. The so-called dahu, or big investors, were taking advantage and making a lot of money in, say, before the crash. And according to him, the government's efforts were to try to offset that. And so I kind of didn't get, why that's, shouldn't they have intervened? Because if they didn't, because I've heard people say they shouldn't have a short sales, others have spoken to, it would have probably been much worse. So I just kind of,
So put your question in one sentence. Why
would we think that it's unfair, that it is incorrect that they intervened?
I'm not sure anybody here has said that it was incorrect. I mean, it's the whole situation was sort of artificial from the beginning, and it was not a true market.
I did say it was dumb. And I'll stand by that. So I'm not saying that this was the right course of action right at that exact moment, but they could have made it so that dividends are paid, that there is clear reporting standards and accounting standards for companies, that there are ways basically to benefit shareholders in a way that a normal market would, should make sure that it's the companies listed on it. I mean, I've tied myself in knots, but the exchanges should and the regulators should be doing that. The reason it's not really a normal market is that nobody is investing on fundamental value. It's just, I heard that this stock is going to go up because of whatever, and that's still happening, by the way. Now it's just like the dahu is the government. So, should they rescue their shoddy market? No, that's like throwing more. It is literally throwing more money at a problem that and entrenching the existing problems with the market instead of fixing them so that it becomes a more efficient allocator of capital and benefits private investors, therefore.
Good answer. It's not an efficient allocator of capital.
You could also consider it a mistake in that they didn't really consider the risks of failing to rescue the market. That the market would step in, have a dramatic rescue, and then the market would continue to drop, and how that would look. So, I mean, there's ways to look at it.
A question over here, Don Morrison.
Hi, I'm Don Morrison. I worked in Asia for time. I'm taught in Tsinghua. That's right. The revaluation of the yuan, is it going to have any significant impact on growth, on China's attempts to, on inflation? Producer prices were way up recently. Is it going to reinforce China's campaign to get the yuan taken seriously as reserve currency, or specifically included next month by the IMF in the basket of currencies that make up special drawing rights. Was this an important?
Or was it a short-term response to slowing
A
exports?
rule of desperation.
Right. So let's zero in specifically, you're not an expert in that. Why did they devalue the currency so suddenly at a moment when they want the currency to become part of the international reserve currency? They wanted to stand strong. Why did they suddenly shift gears on that?
Okay, so I don't love the word devaluation. I think what they did was allow it to revalue. So first, what actually happened? They changed the mechanism by which every day they set the rate at which the yuan trades against the dollar, right? And that is determined by the government. What they said they were going to do, and this is giving the markets a more decisive role, is they would, instead of just kind of picking that to suit whatever their priorities are, they were going to move it to wherever it closed that the previous day, that would be the new point. So, it's allowing markets to determine the value a little bit more. It seems to me that they did not anticipate that people would freak out so much. Now, okay, so why did they do this? I do not think it was exports. The amount is 3% that it went down the first day, or went up, depending on how you think about it. But it lost 3% of its value, which is like not going to do anything for exports. And it's like the yuan has strengthened because it has been tied to the dollar. It has strengthened like 15, 20% in the last year, not really making a dent in that. But what I think probably was the reason, well, there are two things. So there's the Trojan horse theory, which is that Zhou Xiaoquan, who's the head of the central bank, is a very pro-markets, reform-minded guy, and seems to me pretty competent, but doesn't always have control over the central bank. This is one of his pet projects, is getting the yuan to float freely as a way, and this is the Trojan horse, as a way to liberalize the capital account and to let money flow freely and to start, making the economy be market-based, therefore. So maybe he saw his opportunity, he's like, yeah, let's do it.
In some ways, it's fundamentally ambiguous. That in some ways, this is a pro-market move.
Yeah, it's absolutely a pro-market move. I mean, they're defending the currency really aggressively now in Hong Kong today, or yesterday, and so, they're still doing basically what they did before, but now it's, in the market. So
this seems to be the difference. The things they did 10 or 15 years ago didn't have these knock-on effects and reverberate through world markets. Now they do.
So yeah, this will definitely have an impact on, well, New York property. By now. But, well, okay, so here's what I think probably was the biggest factor. This is complicated, but basically, when the yuan was, when foreign investment and huge trade surpluses are happening, in order to keep the yuan cheaper than it should be, it basically like absorbed money from outside the country. So that just all this money pumped into China. But when that stopped happening in the last few years, and really acutely in the last year, the money creation mechanism stops working. Worse, it starts to dry up money, and that causes interest rates to rise, right? And that's really bad when you have around 30 trillion in debt, a lot of which is not at a fixed rate. So, you don't want defaults, you don't want all that bad stuff. So how do they keep rates low? Well, I think what they wanted to do was, we'll lower it a little bit, and we'll do this thing that really we're supposed to be doing, it's justifiable, and the IMF really should like. And we'll just drive the speculators out of the market, and all that stuff about capital outflow, that'll be fine, because they'll go down 3% and done, yeah. And that didn't pan out that way. But your question about inflation is interesting. if you're creating, I think, like, Chinese money supply is something like 80% bigger than the US is. The US is a bigger economy. That's crazy. They have way more money than they should have. So why, with all this money chasing a finite amount of goods, why is inflation going up? It went up in August because of pork prices, okay? But usually producer price inflation is down a ton. It's down like 4 or 5%, and it has been for 2 or 3 years. So why is that happening? It's because overcapacity is so bad because there is so much slack capacity producing, like factories producing at a loss and just like selling stuff overseas because no one in China is buying it. That is overwhelming this insane increase in money. And so that is keeping prices down worldwide, which is, really bad for the global economy. And that will last for many years, probably.
Many years. When I was covering the early stages of the 4 special economic zones, the Chinese were clearly engaged in experimentation in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and other places. They had confined these experiments to the south to see what they would do. They didn't want to introduce them to Beijing or Shanghai because they were worried about how they would turn out. Do you think there's a process of experimentation going on right now? That the Chinese are experimenting with some of these policies just to see how it turns out?
I think a less ambitious form of experimentation goes on all the time. With the rule of law reforms, I use rule of law liberally there. They have pilot programs in places like Shanghai and a few other places around the country where things are supposedly, kind of more experimental. They're doing things like supposedly evaluating judges on a more merit-based basis instead of a more merit-based system instead of just a seniority, etc. It takes a long time for these things to work through the system. The pilot programs in rule of law, for instance, have these kind of 5-year windows or even 7 years, and their goals are by the end of those 5 years or 7 years, we hope to achieve these kinds of targets in improving personnel management, etc. Meanwhile, judges are leaving in droves because those things haven't been, even in Shanghai, because those things haven't been addressed quickly. It's a very slow process. And there's not much faith on the part of young judges. I interviewed a few for a story last year that these reforms will be that effective or how long they'll take. So that's an example. I mean, they definitely do pilots all the time. They love doing pilots around the country. My personal experience whenever I run into them is that they're not very ambitious.
If I could just add, I think, it's interesting, Gady, when you mentioned the system, the sort of introduction of a new system to evaluate officials based on their environmental performance. Actually, China had introduced an environmental responsibility system, sort of the equivalent of the grain responsibility system, in the mid-1990s. And so you can see that, it's basically a reintroduction of reform that never panned out. And one of the things that struck me looking in the environmental field in particular is the number of reforms over the past 10 to 15 years, number of experiments and pilots, because that's right, they love to do these pilots, the number of them that don't get picked up, right? And you hear about experimentation. It could be in land reform, it could be in hukou reform now, definitely in the environmental front. There are all sorts of things, water pricing, whatever it might be, that have been started a long time ago, and then green GDP, whatever, then you don't hear about them. And then you might hear, oh, actually there was a lot of official resistance to this reform, and then there's no more reform, there's no more pilot. And so what has struck me has really been the fact that when you look back at the Deng Xiaoping era, we think of that as, yes, tons of experiments, different kinds of experiments, and then some would be successful, and you'd see them rolled out through the entire country. When I look at the environmental realm in particular, I don't see that kind of experiment success and then a rollout through the system anymore. And I don't know what explains it, but I just haven't seen that same pattern.
Could be resistance from state-owned enterprises making so much money?
Partly that, but I think there might be some other kind of political explanation for it too.
I think we're seeing here just how fundamentally difficult it is for anyone in the outside world to understand, maybe even if you're Chinese, it's difficult to understand these issues. Maybe
Right. I do think Elizabeth makes a great point that it's easy to do a pilot, to start a pilot. It's very hard to implement it systemically because usually you're planting that pilot into a system that the rest of it just does not want to change. It's just normal bureaucratic behavior. Last December, I was in Shanghai for one such pilot, which was in the family planning bureaucracy. You have, at least you used to have, about 1 million or so kind of enforcers of the one-child policy, or just bureaucrats within the one-child enforcement system. And this pilot was in a couple of counties with about 70 of these enforcers, one-time enforcers, and retraining them to do parental kind of guidance on how to parent your kid. So you had people who were going into the homes of people where they had enforced the one-child policy, done sterilizations, prevented them from having second kids, and now they were going and telling these same parents or their children, these are often maybe grandparents and their children who have children, one child, and telling them how to, and kind of playing with their kids. It's an interesting shift and a difficult one. I did find a few of these people were these enforcers. The women among them were pretty into it. And there was a guy I interviewed who was kind of disappointedly smoking on the side, like, this is no fun, kind of like wondering why he even got into enforcing, what exactly was motivating his career path. But this pilot, I have heard from folks connected to this pilot since then that there's a lot of excitement at some level of the bureaucracy to expand it to more places. I don't know where that's going to go, but if you're talking about a kind of a hidebound bureaucracy, the one-child bureaucracy in China is certainly one of the most so.
We have Barbara Demick here from the back row, spent years in China. Would you have one comment or one question you'd want to ask? On basis you just completed your term at the Council on Foreign Relations. So if you had posed the question, the key question, what would it be?
Actually, I was about to follow up on this question from Epoch Times about who it is who lost money in the stock market. From what I've read, I also didn't focus much on the market. There were a lot of the lavish, ordinary people invested in the market, much more so than in the U.S. And one anecdote is in the LA Times Bureau in Beijing. Our cleaning lady was very big on the market, and she used to come very early in the morning to use the office computers because she didn't have a computer at home because she had all her money invested in the stock market to check her stock prices. And my predecessor actually fired her for using the computers. But I've thought about what happened to her when if she lost a lot of money on the market. But maybe
Well, so the question is did the little people lose money and the big people, the big investors make money? Was there a net transfer of wealth in one direction or the other?
Who lost who got?
Usually how it works. The little people are usually later to hear the rumors, etc. One anecdote from the previous run-up of the bull market that might kind of give you a sense. And so this fund manager that I interviewed used to be one of these, what they call zhuangjia, these dealers in the Chinese stock market years earlier. Was telling me how it works now with him. Since he's known as a player, or he was then as a player in the stock market, managers of public, basically mutual funds, but they're state-owned, would come to him and say, so why don't we do this? Why don't you buy some of this stock? Because basically the message being, we'll be buying it in a few days, and it's going to be a huge amount, and then we'll split the proceeds. And he would get this offer all the time. And he was not taking them up on this because he was as Gordy said, told me he wasn't. Because he was sort of, now on the straight and narrow. Now all he would do is he would listen to tips from people, but and act on them, but he wouldn't do that kind of direct insider trading. But this kind of behavior was rampant, state-owned funds, and you'd see occasionally, very occasionally, usually when the market collapses, an arrest or two of the people who run these funds. They're usually the ones jointly run with like Morgan Stanley or et cetera. So there'd be a foreign name involved, and you'd be able to say, this, Morgan Stanley co-run, joint venture was doing this horrible thing, which is called front running, and they had a term for it, which was rat storage, lao shu can. So you store it in your cellar, get some money to store it in your cellar. So rampant practice. What?
So it's actually really confusing, because what is widely reported is that the retail investors, the little guys, are they make up the majority of the trading. That is literally true, but it's trading volume. So I think it's usually around 80% or something like that, and that sounds really bad. But it's only, it's hard to know, but between 9 million and 20 million individual accounts, like little people accounts. And a lot of those are actually companies. One estimate I read is it's about 5% on average, 5% stock market exposure is 5% of household wealth, which, compared to the US is very minimal. So I think a lot of people, I think Rena, you probably didn't do too well, but a lot of the people who were, the last stock crash scared people, and a lot of my friends and stuff were like, no, I would never buy stocks. But younger, like early 20s people were buying a bunch, and there are all these sort of like computer programs you could do for margin trading and all this other kind of really speculative stuff with the more speculative stocks on the smaller market, doing that like crazy. So those have come down a ton, and they definitely, like, a bunch of like early 20 something kids are like really angry and have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. But I don't think that, and this is why I'm so baffled by the stock market thing. It's not like, you had to save the market or else household wealth is going to be wiped out. It's not that case at all. Those younger people, like, okay, they can be mad, they'll make money again, like they're going to be all right, So that's my understanding.
So let's close with just 60-second statements from each of our three panelists about what you see happening in the coming months and years. What are the key things you're going to be looking at? Any predictions about that you have? Starting with you, I'll pick on you first.
Pick on me all night. Okay, so I guess I would say, I go back to what I said at the outset, which is really the only way to even begin to understand China is to look at what's happening on the ground, which is why journalists are so very important, because that's what they do. They look at what's happening on the ground. Because I think it's easy. You just listen to leaders' statements, or you look at what's going on at sort of the elite level, in US-China relations, and you can get one, very different understanding of what's happening in China. But if you really try to, demarcate, take a reform by reform approach and say, okay, here's what they said they're trying to do. Where are we seeing progress? Where are we not seeing progress? And what does this suggest for what this country is going to look like 3 years or 5 years out? I think that's the only way. I don't make predictions.
You make predictions. Right here's one big one.
Well, not mine, and not really a prediction, it turns out. I guess my prediction would be you can just plaster this on your website right before China actually does collapse. But that China won't be collapsing anytime soon, and that's sort of to answer your question. The question that started this panel is, but get used to these blips, get used to rougher waters. And you got at one of the main reasons. We are so much more, China is so much more integrated with the world, and our fates are so much more integrated with China, although less so for us from that perspective than it is true for China in terms of integrating with the world. That whatever, when China stumbles, the rest of the world feels it. And actually the rest of the world actually even knows about it. I mean, this kinds of huge dislocations from China's perspective have been happening over the course of all these several decades. There have been big ups and downs. And with the exception of 1989, I wouldn't say the rest of the world was paying attention. It just didn't matter as much. If there were massive state layoffs, and there were huge protests in Northeast China, I would say most of the world didn't care. Now, if that were to happen, if the same sort of level of unrest were to happen, I think the rest of the world would be paying much closer attention because they know it matters more to the rest of the world.
So Gwen, what are you looking at being the most important issues going forward?
Well, we discussed this SOE reform. That should be coming out soon. That's a really key issue. And you can see it as a bellwether for
The state-owned enterprises. So,
yes,
so either they will undertake some sort of significant reform, or they'll double down and just continue to control state-owned enterprises as firmly as they have in the past.
Right, and if that happens, that's bad for households. So that China rebalancing thing, that's not going to happen for a much longer period of time. It also, however, probably means that it's going to take a lot longer for the global economy to come out of this period where there's just not enough demand. Because that thing I was talking about, like China will continue to, through its SOE support, export all the stuff that it shouldn't be producing. So those are, obviously not good things. As far as actual political stability goes, I guess, what do you watch? But unemployment, like what's happening in the Rust Belt and the interior, who really knows like how that could shake out? But the worse that gets, the harder it is going to be to end hukou, so that you could have labor mobility, which is important for sort of being a more productive economy, a more vibrant one. But it could also like have a bunch of rural people mob the cities, and all the people in the cities get upset. So that could be very destabilizing. So,
well, maybe I have final words. Is that what you said, Gady, seems to be the point that these things have been going on in China, disruptions and rises and falls in various segments and various ministries, various state-owned enterprises, but we didn't, aside from 1989, we didn't pay that much attention to it. But now it matters more than it ever has mattered, and so we're living in the China's neighborhood. We're part of the neighborhood now in a way we never have been before. So it's fascinating. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to our panelists, our expert panelists. Thanks very much. Don't be good. I mean, just staggering how complex all this is.
I would just like to make one plug for the Overseas Press Club. I'm Patricia Krams, the executive director. There's a number of NYU students. It only costs $20 to join. We have some applications outside and our bulletin and other materials that will tell you what we're doing.
You guys members?
Last question.